He was only 5 years old when he vanished from Copper Creek Lake in eastern Tennessee on a sweltering July afternoon in 1998. One moment, Daniel Mitchell was building sandcastles at the water's edge. The next, he was gone. No screams, no witnesses. How does a child disappear in broad daylight from a crowded public beach? And what happens to a life that simply vanishes? Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Copper Creek Lake sits in Hawkins County, eastern Tennessee, about 45 minutes from Kingsport, nestled in the Appalachian foothills where Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina meet like three old friends, leaning together. In 1998, the county seat held a population of just 8,000 souls, and Copper Creek Lake State Park was the region's pride. Sarah Mitchell was 32 years old that summer, an elementary school teacher at Copper Creek Elementary, known for reading aloud with different character voices that made even reluctant students lean forward to listen. She'd been married 8 years and wore her brown hair in a practical ponytail that kept it off her neck in the heat. Michael Mitchell, 34, worked as an HVAC technician, steady work that kept his hands permanently stained with grease under the nails no matter how hard he scrubbed. He was a quiet man who showed love through actions rather than words, the kind of father who coached t-ball on Saturday mornings and built tree houses that passed structural inspection. The summer before, he'd spent 3 weekends constructing a treehouse for Daniel, complete with a rope ladder and a wooden sign that said Danny's Fort in careful block letters. Daniel James Mitchell had just turned 5 that May. Freckles scattered across his nose like someone had flicked a paintbrush in his direction. A gap showed between his front teeth when he smiled. His hair had a cowlick on the left side that refused to lay flat no matter how much Sarah smoothed it down with water. He loved dinosaurs, especially velociraptors, and could recite facts about the Cretaceous period that amazed his kindergarten teacher. Shy around strangers but adventurous in nature, he collected smooth stones from the lake and kept them in a shoebox under his bed. His stuffed bear, worn smooth from constant handling, was named Captain for reasons Daniel could never quite explain. Sunday dinners happened at Sarah's mother's house, where 3 generations gathered around a table that barely fit everyone. Bedtime followed a strict routine: 3 books, a glass of water, and Captain the bear tucked in just right with his head on the pillow. Michael had been teaching Daniel to skip stones at the lake, his small hand wrapped in his father's larger one as they practiced the wrist flick that sent flat rocks bouncing across the water's surface. Sarah made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse on Saturday mornings, using blueberries for eyes and a strawberry slice for the smile. Saturday morning in July 1998 started like 100 others. Sarah packed the cooler with sandwiches and juice boxes, while Michael loaded beach chairs into the truck. Daniel woke at 6:45 to sunlight streaming through his dinosaur curtains, the room already warm despite the early hour. His favorite clothes were laid out on the chair beside his bed. Red swimming trunks with white stripes down the sides, the fabric slightly faded from repeated washings. "Can we feed the ducks?" Daniel asked, a milk mustache decorating his upper lip. Sarah smiled as she packed the canvas beach bag. "If you eat all your banana." Michael ruffled his son's hair, still damp from the quick shower Sarah had insisted on. "And we'll see if we can catch tadpoles in the shallows." Daniel had insisted on bringing Captain the bear despite Sarah's concerns about losing it in the water. They'd compromised with a solution that satisfied everyone. Captain could come along, but had to stay in the truck where he'd be safe and dry. Daniel carefully buckled the bear into the back seat, a habit he'd developed on his own that made Sarah's heart squeeze with affection every time she witnessed it. At 8:15, Michael's truck rattled down Highway 70. Gravel pinging against the undercarriage windows rolled down because the air conditioning had stopped working 3 weeks earlier and hadn't been worth fixing yet. Daniel sat in the middle of the bench seat, held secure by the lap belt, his legs swinging because his feet didn't quite reach the floor. They arrived at Copper Creek Lake at 9:20 in the morning. The parking lot was already half full, dust clouds rising from the gravel as cars maneuvered into spaces. Michael paid the $3 day use fee at the ranger station, and Park Ranger Wilson waved them through with a friendly nod. Sarah made a mental note as they walked toward the beach, counting approximately 40 other families visible on the sand, a good crowd but not overwhelming. By 9:35, they'd claimed their spot near Pavilion Number 3, about 50 yards from the water's edge. Sarah spread out their faded beach blanket blue with white anchors, the fabric worn soft from years of use. Michael set up 2 folding chairs and wrestled the umbrella into position, jamming its pole deep into the sand. The cooler went into the shade where it would keep everything cold until lunchtime. Sarah's canvas bag held towels, sunscreen, a first aid kit, her paperback novel, and a Ziploc bag of goldfish crackers. 11:10. Sarah glanced up from her paperback at 11:15, reaching into the canvas bag for her water bottle. Her head stayed down for perhaps 30 to 45 seconds, no more than the time it takes to unscrew a cap and take a drink. Michael was still at the bathhouse, where 3 people remained ahead of him in line, a fact that would later be confirmed by multiple witnesses who remembered the wait being unusually long that morning. When Sarah looked up at 11:18, the red swimming trunks were not visible in the immediate area. Her first reaction wasn't alarm, but mild annoyance. He was 5 years old. 5-year-olds wandered. He'd probably stood up and walked closer to the water. Maybe he'd gone looking for Michael. But by 11:19, Sarah was on her feet, scanning the beach with increasing urgency. Her voice carried that particular tone mothers develop, hovering between annoyance and the first whisper of concern. Danny Michael returned from the bathhouse at 11:21. His first words, a question. "Where's Danny?" The sandcastle remained untouched and complete, the red plastic shovel stuck upright in the wet sand like a tiny flag marking the spot where a child had simply ceased to exist. Within minutes, both parents were moving in opposite directions along the beach, their voices growing louder, more desperate. Michael ran into the water despite the poor visibility, diving down repeatedly to feel along the murky bottom with his hands. Sarah moved between family groups, asking everyone if they'd seen a little boy 5 years old, red swimming trunks, gray dinosaur shirt. By 11:23, strangers were standing up, abandoning their own activities to join the search. Parents held their own children a little closer, while simultaneously fanning out to cover more ground. Someone checked the bathhouse, calling into both the men's and women's sides. Someone else ran to the playground. Another person sprinted to the parking lot to see if somehow a confused child had wandered that far. The park ranger received a call at 11:28. The 911 operator heard Sarah's voice at 11:32, breaking as she tried to explain that her son had vanished, that he'd been right there, that she'd only looked away for a moment. By the time the first sheriff's deputy pulled into Copper Creek Lake's gravel parking lot, Daniel Mitchell had been missing for 17 minutes. The plastic shovel still stood upright in the wet sand. By sunset, those 17 minutes would become hours that felt like years. By morning, they'd become days that would stretch into an eternity of not knowing. For Sarah and Michael Mitchell, time would stop altogether in that moment, at 11:20, when they realized their son was gone and might never, ever come back. Sheriff Tom Hendricks assumed command at 12:10, establishing a command post in the parking lot with folding tables and radios crackling with constant updates. Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency dispatched boat patrols to search the lake waters. Tennessee State Park Rangers arrived in force, 8 officers total, each assigned to specific search sectors. The parents were interviewed separately. Standard procedure in any missing child case, though investigators quickly ruled out parental involvement. The timeline was too tight, the witnesses too numerous, the genuine anguish too apparent. By 12:45, approximately 75 volunteers had assembled, as news spread through the small community with the speed that only genuine crisis can generate. A grid search was established, covering the beach area surrounding woods and hiking trails. Divers went into the lake near the beach, though visibility extended only 3 to 4 feet in the murky water that had been churned up by swimmers all morning. 4 search quadrants were designated, each with a team leader responsible for coordinating efforts and reporting findings. The bloodhounds arrived at 1:30 in the afternoon. Duke and Sadie, both experienced tracking dogs from Sullivan County Sheriff's Office, were given Daniel's T-shirt from that morning, pulled from the dirty laundry basket at the Mitchell home by Sarah's mother, who'd driven there with a deputy to retrieve it. What the dogs discovered would fundamentally change the nature of the investigation. They tracked Daniel's scent from the sandcastle area toward the parking lot, approximately 80 yards of clear trail. And then the scent simply stopped at the edge of the gravel parking area, as if Daniel had evaporated into thin air. The handler's assessment was delivered in the carefully neutral tone of someone who'd seen this pattern before. Scent trail ends abruptly. Suggests vehicle involvement. Between 2 and 6 that afternoon, more than 150 volunteers combed through every inch of the 300-acre park. They searched all 6 miles of hiking trails, checked every bathroom stall, looked inside, storage sheds and maintenance buildings, examined the space under every dock. 68 family groups were interviewed, approximately 240 people total each. Asked the same questions about what they'd seen, when they'd seen it, and whether anyone or anything had seemed out of place. A helicopter from Tennessee Emergency Management Agency conducted aerial searches using thermal imaging equipment, flying low enough that the rotor wash sent waves across the lake's surface and scattered beach towels across the sand. The result of all this massive, coordinated effort was exactly nothing. No trace of Daniel Mitchell, no abandoned clothing, no witnesses to an abduction, no suspicious vehicles, nothing. The first media briefing happened at 6 that evening, with local television stations from Kingsport and Johnson City setting up cameras in the parking lot. Sheriff Hendricks faced the cameras and chose his words carefully, knowing that everything he said would be analyzed and repeated. "We're treating this as a critical missing child case. We need the public's help. Someone out there saw something, even if they don't realize its significance." Daniel's kindergarten picture from 3 months earlier was distributed to every media outlet. A formal school photo where his cowlick had been temporarily tamed, and his gap-toothed smile looked slightly uncertain, the way children's smiles often do when a photographer tells them to. Say cheese. The search continued through the night, with portable lights transforming the park into an otherworldly landscape of harsh shadows and desperate activity. Flashlight beams swept through the woods in systematic patterns. Search dogs barked in the distance. The helicopter's spotlight made slow passes overhead, turning night into temporary day in shifting circles. The temperature dropped to 68 degrees, and concern grew for a child's survival if lost in the woods wearing nothing but swim trunks and a t-shirt. Sarah and Michael refused to leave the park, sitting in their truck, wrapped in blankets provided by Red Cross volunteers who'd arrived with coffee and sandwiches that no one could eat. Sarah's mother came and simply held her daughter without speaking, because there were no words adequate for this particular horror. By Sunday morning at 6, 24 hours after Daniel had vanished, the search radius had expanded to 5 miles. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team had been officially notified. Media coverage was intensifying, with regional news stations picking up the story. The realization was settling in with the weight of stones. This wasn't a child who'd wandered off and gotten lost. This was an abduction carefully executed in broad daylight under the noses of 200 witnesses who'd seen nothing. The evidence collected told a story full of frustrating gaps. The red plastic shovel and yellow bucket were processed for fingerprints, yielding only prints from Daniel and family members. Dozens of footprint impressions marked the sand near the sandcastle area, but the heavily trafficked beach made isolating any individual child's prints impossible. Hair samples from the Mitchell family vehicle were taken for the DNA database. Photographs documented the exact location with careful timestamps. What haunted investigators more than what they'd found was what they hadn't found. No signs of struggle in the sand, no abandoned clothing items, no objects left behind by a potential abductor, no witnesses to the actual abduction moment, no suspicious vehicle descriptions, no ransom note or contact of any kind. The divers found nothing in the lake depths, no snagged clothing, no evidence that Daniel had ever been in the water beyond the shallow wading everyone had witnessed earlier that morning. The forensic assessment was delivered in the clinical language that somehow made terrible news feel even worse. Clean abduction. Opportunistic or pre-planned nature unknown. No physical evidence of perpetrator presence. The search dog's scent trail ending at the parking lot suggested that Daniel had either walked with someone to a vehicle or been carried there. But this distinction offered no comfort and no leads. 312 people were interviewed in the first 48 hours. Linda Patterson, 41 years old, from Kingsport, told investigators she'd seen Daniel building his sandcastle around 11:10. He was alone, but his parents weren't far away. Very normal scene. Then my kids wanted ice cream from the concession stand, so I wasn't watching that direction. Maybe 3 or 4 minutes later, I looked back and he wasn't there anymore. I thought he'd gone to his parents. Travis Holbrook, a 16-year-old lifeguard on duty that day, explained his limited vantage point. I was watching the water. That's my job. I remember seeing the kid earlier in the morning with his dad, both of them collecting rocks. But around 11:15 to 11:30, I was focused on swimmers. I heard the mother start yelling his name, maybe 11:25. That's when I knew something was wrong. Marcus Webb, a park maintenance worker, provided what would later be considered a crucial piece of information, though its significance wouldn't be understood for years. I was emptying trash bins near Pavilion Number 2, about 75 yards from where the kid was playing. I saw someone walking briskly toward the parking lot, maybe 11:20, 11:25. Adult male, I think, though I couldn't see clearly enough to be certain. But I didn't see a child with them. Could have been anyone heading to their car. Didn't think anything of it at the time. The inconsistencies and frustrations mounted with each interview. Nobody remembered seeing Daniel walk away from his sandcastle. Nobody remembered seeing an adult interact with him. Multiple people remembered the commotion of the other children running past, but that brief distraction may have been precisely what an abductor had waited for. Time estimates varied wildly because human memory proved unreliable for precise timing, especially when people were relaxed and not paying particular attention. 0 credible eyewitnesses to the actual abduction emerged despite hundreds of people being present. The initial suspect pool included immediate family members, though they were cleared within 4 hours. Michael's presence at the bathhouse was confirmed by 4 witnesses who remembered the unusually long wait. Sarah remained visible on the beach, confirmed by multiple nearby families. Extended family members had verified alibis. No family dysfunction existed, no custody disputes, no financial motives, no life insurance policies that would benefit from a child's disappearance. 6 registered offenders with concerning histories lived within a 20-mile radius. All were located and interviewed within 48 hours. Their alibis were verified and none had been near the park that day. Ongoing surveillance was maintained on 2 individuals with prior offenses involving children, but neither showed any suspicious behavior or knowledge of Daniel's whereabouts. Every license plate in the parking lot had been documented, 94 vehicles total. Their owners traced and interviewed over the following week. One anomaly emerged from this systematic process. A single male in the tent camping area had registered under the name David Coleman, 38 years old, listing an address in Nashville that would later prove completely false. He'd stayed Friday and Saturday night, checking out Sunday morning before the full investigative apparatus had been assembled. Park Ranger Wilson had interviewed Coleman Saturday afternoon during routine campground rounds. Said he was solo hiking, enjoying the solitude. Seemed normal enough cooperative when I asked about his plans. Mentioned he'd seen a boy running toward the woods earlier in the day, but thought the kid was just playing. Didn't think much of it. Certainly didn't seem suspicious. This would later be recognized as the critical mistake that would haunt everyone involved. Coleman had been allowed to leave Sunday morning before FBI involvement, before the investigation recognized that they were dealing with an abduction rather than a drowning or a child lost in the woods. Later attempts to locate David Coleman revealed that no one matching his description existed in Nashville records. No valid driver's license. The camping registration form contained fake information throughout. This man had disappeared as completely as the child he'd taken. By Wednesday, 5 days after Daniel vanished, the sheriff's office was forced to acknowledge publicly what everyone involved already knew privately. They'd likely had the abductor in their hands and simply let him walk away. The first week progressed with the terrible momentum of a crisis that everyone hopes will resolve but increasingly knows won't. Monday and Tuesday saw the search radius expand to 10 miles, while the FBI officially took over, setting up a command center in Rogersville with computers and wall charts and the systematic machinery of federal investigation. The press conference on Tuesday afternoon showed Sarah making a tearful plea holding Captain the Bear because she couldn't hold her son, her voice breaking as she begged whoever had Daniel to please bring him home. A tip line was established with an 800 number generating more than 200 calls on the first day alone. Not one proved credible. Age progression technology wasn't yet common in 1998, but Daniel's photo was distributed to all schools, hospitals, and bus stations within a 500-mile radius, his face becoming one more among many on the walls of public places where missing children watched passers-by with frozen smiles. By Thursday and Friday, the reality was settling in with crushing finality. This child had been taken by someone who'd planned it well enough to leave no trace. The massive flyer campaign began with Daniel's face appearing on every telephone pole, store, window, and gas station bulletin board across 3 states. A reward fund was established through community donations reaching $25,000 by week's end. Search teams were reduced to core investigators as volunteers returned to jobs and responsibilities. The initial crisis energy giving way to the long, grinding work of an investigation that might never be solved. The Mitchells' life remained frozen while everyone else's moved forward. Other families packed up their beach gear and went home. Other children returned to summer camps and swimming lessons. But Sarah couldn't return to the ordinary rhythms of life when her child was somewhere unknown, possibly suffering, possibly calling for her, possibly already gone in ways she couldn't let herself think about. But as July became August, as the search teams packed up their equipment and the news cameras found other tragedies to cover, as life in Hawkins County slowly returned to normal for everyone, except the Mitchells, one piece of information remained buried in a stack of witness statements. Park Ranger Wilson had noted it carefully in his report following proper procedure. Solo camper David Coleman, Nashville, seemed nervous but cooperative. That name, that fake name, would haunt investigators for 14 years, because David Coleman was never just a camper passing through. He'd been watching the Mitchell family all morning, waiting for the precise moment when attention wavered, when the chaos of other children created a second of distraction. And by the time anyone thought to look for him seriously, he'd vanished as completely as the child he'd taken. The first month passed with the surreal quality of a nightmare that wouldn't end. By August, the FBI had scaled back active investigation while maintaining that they were following all leads, a phrase that became meaningless through repetition. Sarah returned to work because they couldn't afford for her not to, moving through her days teaching other people's children while her own child was missing. Michael stopped sleeping properly, driving to Copper Creek Lake every Sunday to walk the beach and stare at the water as if Daniel might suddenly appear. Daniel's bedroom remained exactly as he'd left it that Saturday morning. Dinosaur sheets on the bed. Toy cars lined up on the shelf in careful rows organized by color the way Daniel had insisted. Captain the Bear returned to his place on the pillow by Sarah, who couldn't bring herself to throw away or pack up anything that belonged to her son. By December, they faced their first Christmas without Daniel. Sarah bought presents anyway, wrapping them in paper covered with snowmen and placing them under the tree where they sat unopened. Michael drank more and spoke less, and the marriage strained under the weight of grief that had no outlet and no end. They clung to each other because no one else could possibly understand what it felt like to have your child simply erased from the world. An anonymous call came to the tip line reporting a boy matching Daniel's description in Alabama. Investigators followed up immediately, finding a child who looked vaguely similar but wasn't Daniel. This pattern would repeat itself dozens of times over the coming years. Hope ignited by a reported sighting, then crushed by the reality that it was another family's child, another false lead, another dead end. July of 1999 marked the first anniversary of Daniel's disappearance. A candlelight vigil was held at Copper Creek Lake, attended by approximately 50 people who stood in a circle on the beach where a boy had vanished. Sheriff Hendricks, now retired, attended, and later told a reporter it remained the worst case of his career, the one that still woke him at night. The case was officially moved to cold status. The file boxes relocated to basement storage, where they gathered dust alongside other unsolved mysteries. But Detective Frank Morrison, a young investigator who'd been new to the missing persons unit when Daniel disappeared, made a personal decision that would matter 14 years later. He added Daniel's file to his own active cases, the ones he reviewed regularly on his own time, refusing to let the case go cold in his heart, even if the system had declared it so. Years 2 and 3 brought different kinds of pain. Sarah became involved with the Tennessee Missing Children's Coalition, transforming her grief into advocacy because doing something felt better than doing nothing. Michael built a memorial bench at Copper Creek Lake, working on it in his garage through the winter, installing it in the spring with a brass plaque that read, In memory of Daniel James Mitchell, July 17, 1998, Forever 5. A false lead in North Carolina brought temporary hope when a boy was found living with a transient couple. DNA testing proved he wasn't Daniel, and the disappointment felt like losing him all over again. Age progression photos were created showing what Daniel might look like at 7, then 8. His face artificially aged by software that could only guess at how time would change his features. These images were distributed widely, but generated no solid leads. Media attention faded, except for anniversary stories that followed the same pattern each year. Still no answers in Copper Creek Lake disappearance. The Mitchells separated briefly during year 4, their grief pulling them in opposite directions until they realized they were stronger together than apart. They reconciled after 6 months and began marriage counseling, learning how to survive what shouldn't be survivable. Daniel's case was featured on America's Most Wanted in 2003, generating a spike of over 400 tips that investigators dutifully followed. All led nowhere. The sketch of David Coleman, based on Park Ranger Wilson's description, was distributed nationally, but no viable identification emerged. Investigators operated on the working theory that Daniel had been taken by a drifter, that he'd likely not survived long, that his remains might never be found. The years accumulated like sediment. New sheriffs took office and promised to keep the case active, though everyone understood these were mostly symbolic gestures. Sarah stopped buying birthday presents, but continued lighting candles on July 17th each year. Michael's mother passed away in 2005, and at her funeral relatives whispered that at least she didn't have to suffer through, not knowing what happened to Danny. A routine established itself, the kind of routine that forms around wounds that won't heal. Sarah visited Daniel's grave marker every Sunday, after church, placed there despite the absence of a body because they'd needed somewhere to go, somewhere to put flowers and speak words into the air that might somehow reach him, wherever he was. Marriage counseling continued, giving them tools to navigate grief that had no endpoint. By 2007, Daniel would have been 14 years old. Sarah imagined middle school, the awkwardness of puberty first crushes the terrible, wonderful chaos of adolescence. By 2009, he would have been 16, learning to drive, perhaps playing sports, making plans for college. Each milestone that passed unmarked was another kind of loss, another reminder of all the moments they'd never witness. DNA samples were re-entered into upgraded databases as technology improved, offering a small thread of hope. Maybe someday, investigators said, DNA will solve this. Other missing children cases in Tennessee brought Sarah into contact with families facing their own nightmares, and she became an unofficial support network. The person who understood that false hope could be worse than no hope at all. Michael tried once to dismantle Daniel's room, thinking perhaps it was time to move forward. He removed one poster from the wall, a chart of dinosaur species, and broke down completely. Everything went back exactly where it had been. The room remained a shrine to a 5-year-old boy who would never return to claim it. By 2010 and 2011, Sarah had turned 44 and Michael 46, though both looked much older, aged by stress and sorrow that had taken its toll in gray hair and lines around their eyes. Both developed stress-related health issues. Sarah's blood pressure required medication. Michael had a minor heart event that his doctor attributed to years of sustained anxiety. The memorial bench at Copper Creek Lake weathered over time, its wood fading and paint peeling. Michael repainted it himself one Saturday, taking more care with the task than strictly necessary because these small acts of maintenance felt like the only thing he could still do for his son. Case files were digitized in preparation for potential future investigation, part of a statewide effort to modernize cold case records. Detective Morrison, now a seasoned investigator with 20 years of experience, still pulled Daniel's file every few months. He'd sit at his desk after hours, reading through witness statements he'd practically memorized, looking for connections everyone had missed, any thread that might unravel the mystery. The camping registration with David Coleman's fake information had been preserved, and Morrison studied the handwriting as if it might reveal something new. Daniel's room became a time capsule of 1998. The dinosaur curtains faded from sunlight that streamed through the window each afternoon. The calendar on the wall remained stopped at July, as if time itself had given up. Toy cars stayed arranged by color, their paint chipping slightly, but their precise organization maintained by Sarah during her weekly dusting. A crayon drawing hung on the wall, stick figures representing family standing in front of a house beneath a smiling sun. The growth chart on the doorframe showed pencil marks climbing upward, stopping at 3 feet 4 inches, the last measurement ever taken. The unspoken questions never stopped circling. Is he alive? Hope whispered yes, while logic suggested no. Did he suffer? This was the question that woke Sarah at 3 in the morning, the one that made sleep feel like betrayal. Because how could she rest peacefully when her child might have been terrified? Does he remember us? If he's alive, somewhere, does he even know his own name? Will we see him again? In this life or the next? Michael's faith had wavered over the years, while Sarah's intensified, each finding different ways to cope with the unendurable. And then, in March of 2012, 14 years, 8 months, and 11 days after Daniel Mitchell vanished from Copper Creek Lake, something extraordinary happened at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Ryan Carter sat in the Student Union building watching volunteers set up tables for a Red Cross blood drive. He was 19 years old, a college freshman studying business administration, because he hadn't quite figured out what he wanted to do with his life yet. He didn't particularly want to donate blood. He'd always hated needles, had nearly fainted during a vaccination in high school, and generally avoided medical procedures whenever possible. But there was a girl in his biology class, Jessica something, who'd mentioned she was volunteering at the drive. Ryan thought maybe if he donated, he'd have an excuse to talk to her. Maybe ask if she wanted to grab coffee after her shift ended. These were the mundane concerns of a 19-year-old college student on a Wednesday afternoon. The kind of ordinary thoughts that filled ordinary lives. At 2:15, Ryan stood at the table staring at consent forms, his hesitation obvious enough that Jessica noticed. First time donating, she asked, her smile encouraging. Yeah, Ryan tried to sound casual despite his nervousness. Do I really need to do all these forms? Just standard stuff. Medical history, consent for database inclusion. She pointed to a checkbox on the second page. This one's optional. Lets them enter your DNA into a national donor registry. They cross-reference for disease markers and family matching. Some people opt out for privacy reasons. Ryan checked the box without reading it carefully. He was 19 and felt invincible, and was mostly thinking about whether Jessica would say yes to coffee. The needle prick hurt more than expected, and he looked away, focusing on the cinder block wall painted institutional beige while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The whole process took 12 minutes. They gave him a cookie and orange juice. Jessica thanked him for donating. He asked about coffee. She said maybe next week. He forgot about it entirely, returning to his dorm room to study for an economics midterm, the blood donation already fading from his mind. 6 weeks later, on April 27th, at 6:47 in the evening, Ryan's phone rang. Unknown number, Tennessee area code. He almost didn't answer, assuming it was a telemarketer. Hello, is this Ryan Carter? The voice was male, official sounding, with an edge that made Ryan's stomach tighten. Yes, this is Detective Frank Morrison with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Cold Case Unit. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Ryan's first thought was that something must have happened to his mother. Is something wrong? Did something happen, son? I need to ask you some questions about your family history. Specifically about your birth and early childhood. Can you tell me? Do you have any medical records from before age 6? What, I don't think so. Why Ryan's confusion was deepening into something that felt like fear, without understanding why. Where were you born, Ryan? I don't actually know. My mom said we moved around a lot when I was little. She doesn't really like talking about it. The pause on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Ryan wondered if the connection had dropped. Ryan, I need you to listen carefully. Your DNA from a recent blood donation was flagged in a missing persons database. We have a potential match to a child who disappeared in 1998. His name was Daniel Mitchell. The economics textbook slid off Ryan's lap onto the floor. He didn't notice. His hands had gone cold. I don't understand. What does that mean? It means we need to run a confirmatory test. Can you tell me about your mother? Her full name, Diana Harper. She lives here in Winston-Salem. She raised me by her. Ryan's voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and mechanical. Another pause, this one even longer. Ryan, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you deserve the truth. We have reason to believe you may be Daniel Mitchell, the child who went missing from Copper Creek Lake 14 years ago. The room tilted. Sound became muffled, as if Ryan had suddenly been plunged underwater. He heard himself say, "That's impossible," but his voice seemed to come from far away. Detective Morrison hadn't slept that night. He'd spent the hours pulling Daniel Mitchell's file from digital archives, cross-referencing every detail, building the case he'd need to present to his superiors, and eventually to the Mitchell family. The DNA match had shown 15 genetic markers, consistent with Sarah and Michael Mitchell's profiles, which had remained on file since 1998. The probability of match was 99.97%, but protocol required confirmatory testing before families were contacted. The records search on Diana Harper revealed a pattern that made Morrison's investigative instincts flare. She was 44 years old, employed as an administrative assistant at a medical office in Winston-Salem with no prior criminal record. But her Social Security records showed she'd moved to North Carolina in August of 1998, exactly 1 month after Daniel's disappearance. Her previous address had been in Nashville, Tennessee, which shared a border with Hawkins County. The birth certificate filed for Ryan Harper in North Carolina, dated September 1998, set off immediate red flags. It claimed a home birth with no hospital records. It listed Ryan's age as 3 years old at the time of filing, which would place his birth in 1995 rather than 1993 like Daniel. The certificate had been filed 2 months after Diana moved to the state, and there was no documentation of Ryan Harper existing anywhere before August 1998. Morrison obtained warrants for a confirmatory DNA test and to search Diana Harper's residence. The FBI was requested to join the investigation, given that child abduction across state lines constituted a federal crime. Morrison's theory was taking shape. Diana Harper was connected to the mysterious David Coleman, either as an accomplice or as someone who'd received a kidnapped child, perhaps believing some fabricated story about the boy needing a home. Ryan voluntarily submitted to a cheek swab for the confirmatory test, still in shock, still insisting there must be some mistake. The results were rushed through in 5 days, instead of the standard 2 weeks. On May 3rd, the confirmation came back 99.99% certainty. Ryan Carter was Daniel Mitchell. Surveillance on Diana Harper began immediately. FBI agents observed her daily routine, noting that she appeared increasingly nervous, checking her phone frequently, looking over her shoulder. On May 2nd, she attempted to withdraw $8,000 from her savings account, a transaction the bank flagged as suspicious. Concerned she might flee, the FBI moved up their timeline for arrest. The search warrant was executed on Diana Harper's residence on May 4th. In a box in the basement, investigators found photocopied missing child flyers for Daniel Mitchell, false identification documents in multiple names and maps of eastern Tennessee from 1998. Most damning was Diana's diary with entries from 1998, referencing someone identified only as D and phrases that would later be used in court. He said the boy needed a better life, and I didn't ask enough questions because I didn't want to know the answers. Photographs of Ryan throughout his childhood revealed a conspicuous gap. No photos existed from before age 5, as if the child had simply materialized into existence at that age. Phone records from 1998 showed Diana Harper had received multiple calls from Tennessee payphones during July of that year. Investigators learned she'd been attending support groups in Nashville during 1997 and 1998 following a divorce. The working theory suggested that David Coleman had met Diana at one of these groups, had groomed her over time, and had convinced her to accept a kidnapped child under false pretenses. The plan for resolution was carefully coordinated. Diana Harper would be arrested at her workplace to prevent any possibility of flight. Ryan would be told the full truth before the arrest occurred, given time to process the information with a psychologist present. The Mitchell family would be contacted only after DNA confirmation was absolute, to prevent giving them false hope after 14 years of disappointment. What law enforcement expected was a relatively straightforward resolution. Harper would confess and claim she'd been misled by Coleman. Ryan would be confused but eventually grateful to know the truth, and the Mitchells would be overwhelmed but joyous at their son's return. What they didn't expect was the depth of Ryan's resistance to his true identity, the complexity of Diana Harper's involvement, and how completely a child's memory could be erased when taken at such a young age. On May 6th, Detective Morrison sat across from Ryan Carter in a private conference room at the FBI field office in Charlotte. Between them on the table sat a file folder containing 2 photographs. Morrison slid them side by side. One was Daniel Mitchell's kindergarten picture from 1998, a 5-year-old boy with freckles and a gap-toothed smile. The other was Ryan Carter's driver's license photo from 2011. A 19-year-old young man with the same green eyes, the same pattern of freckles across his nose, the same stubborn cowlick in his hair that wouldn't lie flat. Ryan stared at the photos for a full minute without speaking, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Then he said the 4 words Morrison had been dreading, "I want my mom." Diana Harper was unlocking the office door on the morning of May 7th, coffee in hand, when 2 FBI agents approached from opposite sides of the parking lot. She dropped her keys before they even spoke. The coffee cup hit the sidewalk, brown liquid pooling around the tire of her Honda Civic. Diana Harper. She didn't ask why they were there. She just whispered, "He found out." In the car after her arrest, she asked only one question: "Is Ryan okay?" Not whether she could call a lawyer, not whether she could make a phone call, just whether the boy she'd raised for 14 years was okay. The interrogation lasted 4 hours, and what emerged was a story more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Diana Harper had been 30 years old in 1998, recently divorced, clinically depressed, and attending a support group for people dealing with loss at a community center in Nashville. David Coleman started coming to the group in early 1998, claiming he'd lost his sister in a drowning accident. He was kind, quiet. He listened in a way that made lonely people feel seen. By June, they'd begun talking after meetings, just coffee, nothing romantic. He'd shared his philosophy about how the world was broken, how children were being raised by people who didn't deserve them, who failed to watch them properly, who were careless with precious lives. Diana insisted she didn't know Coleman was planning to take a child, but by mid-July he'd told her he'd found a boy who needed to be saved. On July 18, 1998, he called and said he had the boy, that the parents had been neglectful, that the child had been left alone near water, and if David hadn't intervened, the boy would have drowned. They met at a motel outside Knoxville. The boy was quiet, didn't cry, didn't ask for his parents. Diana told herself that maybe Coleman was telling the truth, that maybe if the boy had been happy, he would have been screaming for his mother. She knew somewhere deep down that she was doing something wrong, but she'd lost custody of her own daughter in the divorce. She was alone and broken, and this little boy needed someone. She never saw David Coleman again after that night. He gave her $5,000 cash, told her to use it to start fresh, and instructed her to move out of state immediately. He said if she ever contacted him or told anyone, she'd go to prison. So she left Tennessee, filed a false birth certificate in North Carolina, made Ryan younger on paper so school enrollment wouldn't raise questions, and she tried to be a good mother. Her attorney argued that Diana had been manipulated by a predator, that she'd made terrible choices out of mental illness and grief, that her remorse was evident. Morrison's response was blunt. She stole a child and raised him on a foundation of lies for 14 years. Remorse doesn't undo that. Ryan sat in a stranger's living room later that afternoon, a victim advocate on one side, and Dr. Ellen Ramirez on the other, while Detective Morrison explained that the woman he'd called Mom for 19 years had been arrested. "I don't believe you," Ryan said for the 3rd time. "She wouldn't. She loves me." Dr. Ramirez spoke gently. "Ryan, love, and wrongdoing aren't mutually exclusive. Diana Harper may genuinely love you, but that doesn't change what she participated in. What she did was raise me. She took care of me when I was sick. She helped with homework. She came to every baseball game I ever played. That's my mother. Your biological mother is Sarah Mitchell," Morrison said. "She's waited 14 years hoping you'd come home. She's not my mother." Ryan stood, his voice breaking. "I don't know her. I don't remember her. You're telling me my whole life is a lie, my name isn't real, my birthday isn't real, everything I know about myself is fake." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of questions nobody could answer adequately. Ryan's hands shook as he tried to process the impossible. What am I supposed to do with that information? Just become someone else? This Daniel person, I'm not him. I'm Ryan. Ryan Carter. You're both, Dr. Ramirez said softly. You're Ryan, who has lived 19 years with memories and experiences that are real and valid. And you're Daniel, who was loved by parents who never stopped looking for you. You don't have to choose between them. You have to learn to integrate both identities into one person. I can't. Ryan's voice dropped to a whisper. I can't do this. He asked to see Diana Harper. They told him no, not yet. She was in federal custody. He asked if he had to meet the Mitchells. They explained it was his choice, but his biological parents had traveled a long way and desperately wanted to see him. Sarah and Michael Mitchell received the news on May 8th at 9 in the morning. When Sarah saw the sheriff's cars pull into their driveway, her first thought was that they'd finally found Daniel's remains after all these years. She called Michael at work, her voice tight with dread. Come home now, please. They sat together on the couch where they'd held each other through 14 years of grief. Hands clasped, bracing for news that would break whatever pieces of their hearts still remained intact. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, your son is alive. Sarah made a sound that was neither scream nor sob, something beyond language. Michael went completely still, as if moving might shatter this impossible moment. He's 19 years old. He's been living in North Carolina under the name Ryan Carter. A woman named Diana Harper raised him. We've confirmed through DNA testing that he is your son, Daniel. Where is he? Sarah could barely breathe around the words. When can we see him? He's struggling with the information. Doctor Ramirez, the psychologist assigned to his case, believes seeing you might help him process the truth. But you need to understand something. The detective paused, choosing words carefully. He doesn't remember you. He may not want to be called Daniel. He feels loyalty to the woman who raised him. This won't be the reunion you've imagined for 14 years. I don't care, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. He's alive. That's all that matters. The first meeting was arranged for May 10th at 2 in the afternoon, in a deliberately neutral room at the FBI Victim Services Office. Beige walls, soft lighting, comfortable chairs arranged in a circle rather than opposing rows. Dr. Ramirez had explained that no one should rush, no one should force anything, that Ryan needed to control the pace of this reunion. Sarah and Michael arrived 30 minutes early, too anxious to be anywhere else. They'd brought photo albums documenting Daniel's first 5 years. They'd brought Captain the Bear, kept all these 14 years. They'd written a letter but weren't sure they'd have the courage to give it to him. At 2 exactly, the door opened and Ryan walked in. Time suspended in that moment, the air thick with 14 years of grief and hope and impossible possibility. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She saw her son, taller now, face shaped by adolescence, into features she didn't quite recognize but couldn't deny. The green eyes, the freckles, the cowlick that still defied gravity. Michael stood slowly, tears already falling. Danny Ryan flinched at the name as if it had been a physical blow. It's Ryan. I'm sorry. Ryan. Michael's voice cracked. Can we sit down? They sat in terrible, awkward silence, 7 feet of space between them that might as well have been 7 miles. Doctor. Ramirez began speaking, her voice professionally soothing, but the words barely registered for anyone in the room. Sarah couldn't stop staring, trying to reconcile this young man with the 5-year-old boy who'd vanished. You're so tall, she whispered. You were so little. You loved dinosaurs, especially velociraptors, and you had this stuffed bear. She held up Captain with trembling hands. Ryan looked at the bear. Something flickered across his face there, and gone too quickly to interpret. Recognition. Impossible to tell. I don't remember you, he said flatly. I'm sorry, but I don't remember anything. That's okay. Sarah forced the words through tears. We remember you. We never forgot you. Not for a single day in 14 years. I need you to understand something. Ryan's voice shook despite his attempt at control. Diana is my mother. She raised me. Whatever she did, whatever happened back then, she's still my mom. I can't just replace her with you. Michael nodded, understanding in his grief-worn face. We're not trying to replace anything. We just want to know you, if you'll let us. That's all we're asking. Over the next 3 hours with Dr. Ramirez carefully mediating pieces of 2 separate stories came together. Ryan learned he'd been taken from Copper Creek Lake at age 5. His memories of early childhood with Diana had been partly fabricated, partly the natural result of a young child accepting the reality presented to him. His birthday wasn't December 3rd, 1995. It was May 22nd, 1993. He had a whole family history, grandparents and cousins, and a life story that had nothing to do with the past 14 years. The Mitchells learned their son didn't remember them and might never fully remember. He'd had a happy childhood despite it being built on a crime. He felt genuine loyalty to Diana Harper and didn't want her to go to prison. He wasn't sure he wanted to be called Daniel ever again. Recovery, if it happened at all, would take years of therapy and patience and accepting that the 5-year-old they'd lost wouldn't simply reappear in the body of this 19-year-old stranger. The breaking point came when Sarah showed him photographs. Pictures of 5-year-old Daniel at Copper Creek Lake, building sandcastles, red swimming trunks bright in the sunlight, his face showing that expression of intense concentration he'd always had when focused on a task. Ryan stared at the photo for a full minute, his hands beginning to shake. "I've had this dream," he said slowly. "A dream about water and sand and a red shovel. I thought it was just something my brain made up. I thought it wasn't real." "It wasn't a dream," Michael said gently. "It was a memory trying to come back." Ryan started to cry, then deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his conscious control. "I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know what's real. I don't know anything." Sarah wanted desperately to hold him, but didn't know if she was allowed to touch this son who'd become a stranger. "Doctor." Ramirez gave a small nod of permission. Sarah crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around Ryan for the first time in 14 years. He didn't pull away, but he didn't hug back either. He just stood there, shaking, while she held him, and Michael joined them, the 3 of them standing in a circle of grief and relief and confusion, so profound that nobody tried to speak anymore. Finding Daniel Mitchell alive was a miracle, but as the days unfolded, everyone involved realized that miracles come with complications nobody mentions in the stories. Because the biggest question remained unanswered and dangerous. Who was David Coleman? Where was he now? And how many other families might he have destroyed? Diana Harper's trial began in September of 2012. She faced federal charges of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, transportation of a minor across state lines, falsifying government documents, and obstruction of justice. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. DNA evidence, Harper's own confession, the false birth certificate, bearing her signature financial records, showing a $5,000 cash deposit in August 19, 98 phone records connecting her to Tennessee payphones in July of that year, and diary entries showing guilty knowledge. The defense argued Diana had been manipulated by David Coleman, that she'd been mentally ill and genuinely believed she was helping the child, that she'd provided a loving, stable home for 14 years. Her attorney insisted she wasn't a monster but a broken woman who'd made desperate decisions born from depression and grief. Ryan testified for both prosecution and defense, a complicated position that reflected his complicated feelings. For the prosecution, he confirmed the lies. She knew what she was doing was wrong. She kept newspaper clippings about my disappearance hidden in a box. She lied to me my entire life about who I was. For the defense, he spoke about the life she'd given him. She was the only mother I knew. She took care of me. I don't believe she's evil. I believe she's human, and humans make terrible mistakes. The verdict came back guilty on all counts. At the sentencing hearing in November, the prosecution recommended 25 years in federal prison. The defense requested leniency, asking for mental health intervention and probation. Sarah Mitchell gave a victim impact statement that left the courtroom silent. "You stole 14 years from us. 14 birthdays we didn't get to celebrate. 14 Christmases without our son. You watched news reports of us suffering and did nothing. That's not love. That's cruelty." Ryan's statement was shorter and more conflicted. "I'm angry at you, but I also don't know. Part of me will always see you as my mom, and I hate that I feel that way." Diana Harper was led away in handcuffs. She looked back at Ryan one last time and mouthed, "I'm sorry." He didn't respond, couldn't respond, because what response was adequate for this impossible situation? The first 8 months after discovery were marked by slow, painful progress measured in tiny victories and significant setbacks. Ryan moved into a transitional apartment near Wake Forest University, where he'd been enrolled. Therapy with Dr. Ramirez happened 3 times weekly at first, then once weekly as Ryan stabilized. The work centered on identity integration, on accepting that he didn't have to erase Ryan to become Daniel, that he could be both. Memory work proved frustratingly limited. Hypnotherapy was attempted with minimal success. The relationship with his biological parents developed slowly. The first 2 months involved stiff, formal meetings where Ryan called them Sarah and Michael, unable to bring himself to say Mom and Dad, those words feeling like a betrayal of Diana. In month 3, they visited Hawkins County for the first time. Ryan saw his childhood bedroom preserved exactly as he'd left it. He broke down crying and couldn't explain why, the emotions overwhelming any logical understanding. The media attention proved overwhelming. Reporters camped outside Ryan's apartment for weeks. He changed his phone number 3 times as journalists obtained it, and called constantly. The Mitchell family's new normal required adjustments from everyone. Sarah reduced her work hours to be available whenever Ryan called, which wasn't often but meant everything when it happened. Michael started his own therapy, finally addressing the PTSD he'd developed from years of trauma. They sold their old house, unable to live any longer in a place that held so many painful memories, and bought a new place closer to Winston-Salem, cutting the drive time from 4 hours to 2. The unanswered questions haunt everyone involved. Who is David Coleman really? Did he target the Mitchell family specifically? Or was Daniel's abduction opportunistic? Has he taken other children whose disappearances were never connected? Is he still alive? Still out there, possibly? Planning to do this again? These questions keep Detective Morrison checking databases long after retirement, unable to let go of the one case that got away. But the story doesn't truly end with a courtroom verdict, or a therapy breakthrough, or even a tentative reunion between parents and a son who doesn't quite remember them. Because somewhere out there, possibly in another small town with another family enjoying another lake, David Coleman might be living under another name. And unless he's caught, unless someone recognizes him or makes the connection or gets lucky the way Detective Morrison got lucky with a DNA match, there's always the possibility that what happened to Daniel Mitchell could happen again to someone else's child. 10 years have passed since Ryan Daniel Mitchell learned his true identity. It's 2024 now, and Ryan is 31 years old. He lives in Asheville, North Carolina, a choice that feels both random and somehow meant to be. He completed a master's degree in social work, specializing in trauma and family reunification. His work with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has helped dozens of families navigate the impossible terrain of recovery after abduction. In 2020, Ryan published a memoir titled The Stranger in the Mirror: Finding Myself After Being Found. The book became a resource for other survivors, dealing with identity trauma for families trying to rebuild after years of separation. For anyone trying to understand how someone can be lost and found simultaneously. He speaks publicly at conferences, his story helping train law enforcement and mental health professionals in the complexities of long-term missing persons cases. It's not the ending anyone would have chosen to write, but it's an ending. And in cases like these, any ending, even an imperfect one, even one with threads left dangling and questions unanswered, is a kind of grace. If this story reminds you of anything, let it be this: every child matters in ways we can't always see. Every family deserves answers, even when those answers take 14 years to arrive. And persistence, even when hope feels impossible, even when the odds seem overwhelming, even when everyone else has moved on, persistence matters. That's not just his miracle. It's ours to learn from, to honor, and to carry forward into whatever comes next.